Listen closely. There are moments in life when nothing is technically wrong, yet everything feels off. You wake up doing the same things, talking to the same people, walking the same routines, but inside something feels unsettled. You can't explain it. You can't point to one clear problem. You just know that the season you're in no longer fits who you are becoming. And many people mistake that feeling for confusion, frustration, or failure. But what if it's not any of those? What if it's revelation? What if the discomfort you're feeling is not the enemy, but the evidence that God is actively rearranging your future right now? You see, God does not announce season changes with noise. He often introduces them with disruption. That's why some of you walked into this moment carrying questions you couldn't articulate. You've been praying, but your prayers sound different lately. You've been working, but your effort no longer feels fulfilling. You've been faithful, yes. Restlessness keeps knocking on your heart. And I need you to hear this clearly, that unrest may not be a sign that you are behind. It may be a sign that heaven is ahead of you. Scripture tells us in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 1 that to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. Notice, it doesn't say you choose the season, it says there is a season, meaning seasons are assigned, not negotiated. They are initiated by God, not by convenience. Now consider this truth. Many people miss divine season changes because they are emotionally attached to their past. They loved who they were there. They were affirmed there. They were comfortable there. But God is not committed to your comfort. He is committed to your purpose. And when purpose demands movement, God will disturb what you're clinging to so you can step into what He has prepared. That's why Daniel chapter 2 verse 21 declares that God changes the times and the seasons, not man, not the economy, not circumstances, God. Which means if a season is shifting, it's not accidental, it's intentional. Heaven doesn't waste transitions. Interestingly, when God begins to change a season, clarity doesn't come first, pressure does. You don't suddenly feel confident, you feel exposed. You don't instantly feel bold, you feel unsure. Because God often removes familiar support systems before He reveals new assignments. And that's where many people panic. They try to recreate old patterns, revive expired relationships, or force doors that God Himself has closed. But instability is often the soil where breakthroughs are planted. Think about it. Jobs that once excited you now feel draining. Conversations you used to enjoy now feel shallow. Habits that once worked no longer produce growth. That's not rebellion. It's transition. Furthermore, God never changes seasons randomly. He does it strategically. When your capacity has outgrown your environment, God will either expand the environment or move you out of it. And if you refuse to move, frustration becomes your teacher. That's why some of you feel like life is shrinking around you. It's not that God is reducing you, it's that you've outgrown where you are. The room feels small because your assignment is getting bigger. The routine feels heavy because grace has shifted. And what you keep calling confusion is actually a signal that God is saying, you cannot stay here anymore. Remarkably, before God rearranges your future externally, He unsettles you internally. He disrupts your appetite. Things you once tolerated now irritate you. Things you once ignored now bother you. That's because seasons don't just change around you, they change within you. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 1 reminds us that every purpose has a time. Meaning you can be doing the right thing at the wrong time and still be out of alignment. Faithfulness to a past season can become disobedience in a new one. And that's a sobering thought. Consequently, when life begins to feel unstable, don't rush to escape it. Discern it. Ask yourself, what is God trying to shift? Because breakthroughs are rarely comfortable. Promotions often come disguised as pressure. New beginnings often arrive disguised as endings. And God will intentionally allow certain routines to feel too small so you can stop settling for what no longer stretches you. Daniel chapter 2 verse 21 reminds us again that God removes kings and sets up kings. He dismantles structures to introduce new authority. And if God is removing something from your hands, it may be because He's about to place something heavier on your shoulders. So let me declare this over you plainly. If you feel confused, uncomfortable, and unsettled, it may not be because something is wrong. It may be because God is rearranging your future. What you are experiencing is not chaos, it is choreography. Heaven is moving pieces you cannot yet see. And if you stay spiritually sensitive instead of emotionally reactive, you will recognize the season before you waste it. Meanwhile, let's go deeper. Because if you don't understand how seasons work in God's kingdom, you will keep mislabeling divine timing as delay. And you will call preparation punishment. One of the greatest frustrations among believers is not that God is silent, but that God is seasonal. We want permanence where God designed process. We want stability where God ordained movement. And until you understand that seasons are not signs of inconsistency, but evidence of intentional design, you will fight what God is trying to use to grow you. The Bible is very clear about this. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 1 does not say some things have seasons. It says everything has a season. That means your growth has a season, your obscurity has a season, your waiting has a season, your elevation has a season. And here is the truth many people struggle to accept. A season ending does not mean God is angry with you. It means God is finished with that phase of your development. Genesis chapter 8 verse 22 tells us that while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter shall not cease. In other words, change is not a disruption of God's plan. It is proof that God's system is still functioning. Yet many people spiritually suffer because they treat seasons like destinations instead of assignments. They camp where God intended them to pass through. They build emotional houses in transitional places. And when God begins to move, they resist Him. Not because they don't love God, but because they love the familiarity of the season He is closing. That's why productivity begins to die when a season expires. You can still be busy and yet be unfruitful. You can still be faithful and yet feel ineffective. Because fruitfulness is seasonal, not permanent. Now let this sink in. God does not waste seasons. Every season is designed to produce something in you before it produces something through you. Winter builds endurance. Spring restores hope. Summer demands labor. Harvest requires maturity. If you refuse the discipline of one season, you will delay the reward of the next. That's why some prayers feel unanswered. Not because God said no, but because the season has not yet matured what the answer requires. God will not release what you are not yet disciplined enough to manage. Here's where it becomes personal. Some of you are frustrated because you are comparing your current season to someone else's harvest. You are measuring your winter by another person's summer. And that comparison is robbing you of peace and focus. Galatians chapter 6 verse 9 reminds us not to grow weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we do not faint. Notice the phrase due season. That means harvest is tied to timing, not effort alone. You can work hard and still be early. You can pray sincerely and still be premature. Timing is everything in God's economy. What makes seasons challenging is that God rarely explains them while you're in them. He reveals purpose in hindsight, not always in real time. That's why faith is required, not just belief in God, but trust in His timing. Seasons teach you patience, submission, and restraint. They teach you to show up without applause, to obey without explanation, and to grow without recognition. And if you cannot be disciplined in hidden seasons, you will not be trusted in visible ones. Think about real life for a moment. There are seasons where you must learn, not earn. Seasons where you must prepare, not perform. Seasons where God slows you down so He can deepen you. And if you rush out of those seasons because they don't feel productive, you will arrive unprepared to the next level. That's why some promotions collapse. That's why some opportunities become burdens. The season was skipped, so the structure couldn't sustain the weight. So hear this clearly. Delay is not denial, and waiting is not wasting. Seasons are God's way of aligning your character with your calling. When you understand that, you stop fighting where you are and start extracting what the season is meant to teach you. And once the lesson is complete, God Himself will initiate the transition. Because seasons are His responsibility, not yours. Now let's move forward. Because once you understand that seasons are intentional, the next question becomes personal. How do you recognize when God is about to move you? One of the clearest and most misunderstood signs is discomfort. Not sin, not rebellion, discomfort. And this is where many people misjudge themselves and miss God entirely. First, understand this. God rarely uses comfort as a tool for transformation. Comfort preserves, but discomfort produces. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 records God telling Abram, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." Notice what God does not do. He does not show Abram the land first. He creates movement before clarity, discomfort before direction. Because faith does not grow in environments where everything is predictable. What you're feeling right now, the unease, the restlessness, the sense that something must change, is often God's way of loosening your grip on where you are. He makes the familiar feel foreign. He makes the comfortable feel constraining, and you start asking questions you never asked before. Is this really all there is? Why am I no longer fulfilled by this? Those questions are not attacks on your gratitude. They are invitations to growth. Then consider Hebrews chapter 12 verse 11, which says that no chastening for the present seems joyous but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Growth is rarely enjoyable in the moment. Discipline is uncomfortable by design. And when God is preparing to elevate you, He will first disturb you. He will challenge your routines, your mindsets, your habits, because what got you here cannot sustain you there. Think about real life. A job that once stretched you now feels repetitive. A routine that once worked now produces diminishing returns. You're not lazy, you're under-challenged. And when potential is trapped in the wrong season, frustration becomes inevitable. That frustration is not a sign you should quit recklessly. It's a signal you should seek God intentionally. Discomfort is not permission to abandon responsibility. It's instruction to upgrade capacity. What many people do wrong is they numb discomfort instead of discerning it. They distract themselves. They complain. They seek comfort instead of clarity. But God is trying to use that discomfort to awaken discipline, to push you toward prayer, learning, focus, and intentional growth. Because the next season will demand more from you than the current one ever did. Here is the danger. If you ignore discomfort long enough, it turns into dissatisfaction, then bitterness. And bitterness blinds you to God's leading. That's why you must catch it early. Ask, what is this discomfort preparing me for? Because God never makes you uncomfortable without intention. He doesn't disrupt without purpose. He doesn't unsettle without assignment. So if your spirit feels restless, don't suppress it. Submit it. Let it drive you closer to God, not farther from Him. Let it push you toward discipline, not distraction. Because discomfort is often the first whisper that a season is shifting. And if you respond correctly, what feels like pressure will become preparation. Next, understand this truth because it may heal some frustration you've been carrying quietly. When God is changing your season, some doors will close without explanation. No warning, no long conversation, no opportunity to fix it. One day it's there, the next day it's gone. And if you don't interpret this correctly, you will fight God instead of following Him. Revelation chapter 3 verse 7 says that God opens and no one shuts, and He shuts and no one opens. That means when something ends and you cannot revive it no matter how hard you try, it may not be rejection, it may be redirection. God often closes doors you are too emotionally attached to close yourself. Because if He asked you politely, you would negotiate. So He removes the option entirely. This is where faith is tested. Because we like endings that make sense. We like closure. We like explanations. But God is more concerned with obedience than comfort. Isaiah chapter 43 verse 18 to 19 tells us not to remember the former things because God is doing a new thing. Notice the tension. Before you see the new thing, you must release the old one. And release is painful when attachment is deep. Think about real life. A relationship fades even though nothing went wrong. An opportunity disappears just as you were getting comfortable. A plan collapses even though you prayed about it. And your first reaction is panic. Your second reaction is self-blame. But often, God is protecting you from staying too long in a place that would eventually limit you. He ends things early to spare you prolonged frustration later. Here's what many people don't realize. Closed doors are not insults to your faithfulness. They are confirmations of completed assignments. When God is done teaching you what a season was designed to teach, He shuts the door. And if you keep trying to reopen it, you delay your growth. Productivity suffers when you invest energy into expired seasons. You become busy but unfruitful. Now here's the discipline this season demands. Stop chasing what God has shut. Stop replaying what God has ended. Stop begging for access God has intentionally removed. Because every time you look back, you slow forward movement. Lot's wife looked back and froze in a place God was trying to evacuate her from. Genesis chapter 19 verse 26 is a warning, not a story. It tells us what happens when attachment overrides obedience. If God closed the door, trust that He has already secured the next one, even if you can't see it yet. Faith is not knowing where you're going. It's trusting who is leading. And when God closes a door, He's not taking something from you. He's making room for something heavier, something greater, something that matches who you are becoming. So instead of mourning what ended, ask what is opening. Instead of clinging to the familiar, prepare for the future. Because closed doors are often the loudest evidence that a season has truly ended and that another is already waiting. Then pay attention to this, because as doors close and discomfort rises, something else begins to happen quietly. Your sensitivity to God's voice increases. What once felt distant now feels urgent. What once felt optional now feels necessary. And this is not coincidence. It is preparation. When God is about to give new instructions, he sharpens your hearing. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11 to 13 tells us that Elijah did not hear God in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in a still small voice. That means God often speaks most clearly when the noise is reduced. And when a season is changing, God will deliberately disturb external stability so you can pay attention internally. You begin to notice this shift in subtle ways. You're no longer satisfied with surface level prayer. Worship feels deeper. Silence feels necessary. Certain conversations drain you because they carry no direction. You crave clarity, not entertainment. And this heightened sensitivity is dangerous if ignored, because you cannot receive new instructions with old listening habits. John chapter 10 verse 27 says that God's sheep know his voice, but knowing his voice requires proximity. It requires intentional discipline. That's why God begins to pull you away from distractions when a season is shifting. He may change your appetite for social noise, entertainment, even constant activity, not because those things are evil, but because they are loud. This is where self-discipline becomes critical. Early mornings begin to matter. Quiet time becomes sacred. Focus becomes a weapon. Productivity increases not because you're doing more, but because you're doing what matters. God speaks direction before he releases provision. And if you miss the instruction, you will misuse the opportunity. Think about real life again. You start waking up with thoughts you didn't have before, ideas, convictions, nudges. And if you're not careful, you'll call it stress. But it's not stress, it's alignment. God is tuning your frequency because the next season requires precision. You cannot afford to be careless with your time, your energy, or your obedience. Here's the warning. Many people hear God most clearly right before a breakthrough, but they're too distracted to obey. They sense the leading, but they silence it with busyness. And then they wonder why the season feels delayed. Sensitivity without obedience leads to frustration. So if you're hearing God more clearly, don't rush past it. Lean into it. Write it down. Pray it through. Because when God changes your season, he doesn't just move you geographically or professionally. He moves you spiritually. And the clarity you're receiving now is the blueprint for what's coming next. After that, something else begins to happen that many people misinterpret as rejection, when in reality it is refinement, separation, and isolation. Suddenly, the crowd feels wrong. The noise feels heavy. The relationships that once energized you now drain you. And if you don't understand this stage, you will try to reconnect with people God is intentionally creating distance from. Mark chapter 1 verse 35 shows us that Jesus himself withdrew early in the morning to a solitary place to pray. Even the Son of God needed isolation before major movements. And Galatians chapter 1 verse 15 to 17 reveals that Paul went away in isolation after his encounter with Christ before he ever stepped into public ministry. God isolates before he elevates. This isolation is not punishment, it is preparation. God removes certain voices so his voice can become dominant. Because if everyone has access to you, no one has influence over you. Seasons of isolation train focus, clarity, and self-discipline. They teach you how to function without applause, affirmation, or constant validation. You start to notice it practically. Invitations decrease. Conversations change. You no longer feel understood by people who once knew you well. And that can hurt, because familiarity creates comfort. But comfort is expensive. At the next level, God will never promote you and leave you surrounded by distractions that can sabotage the assignment. Here is a growth lesson. Isolation exposes what truly drives you. When no one is watching, do you still pray? When no one is clapping, do you still prepare? When no one is affirming, do you still show up disciplined and consistent? These moments are not lonely, they are formative. Many people fail this stage because they interpret isolation emotionally instead of spiritually. They assume something is wrong with them. But God is simply narrowing their focus. Productivity increases in isolation because clarity replaces comparison. You stop measuring yourself against others and start measuring yourself against obedience. If you fight isolation, you delay elevation, because the next season requires depth, not popularity. It requires maturity, not approval. And God will not allow you to carry old relational weights into new levels of responsibility. So if you feel separated, don't chase reconnection, seek preparation. Use the quiet. Build systems. Sharpen skills. Deepen discipline. Because when God brings you out of isolation, He will bring you out with authority, not insecurity. And finally, recognize this unmistakable sign, because it often confuses even the most faithful people. Increased pressure accompanied by increased grace. Life doesn't get easier immediately. It gets heavier. More responsibility, higher expectations, tighter timelines. And yet somehow, you're still standing. That's not coincidence. That's capacity being revealed. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 records God saying, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Notice the pattern. Weakness increases, but grace increases with it. God never allows pressure without provision. When He is changing your season, He stretches you internally before He promotes you externally. You begin to feel this at work, in ministry, in family, in responsibility. People expect more from you, even without formally acknowledging your growth. You are trusted with more, questioned more, challenged more. And if you don't understand this stage, you will resent the pressure instead of recognizing it as training. James chapter 1 verse 2 to 4 tells us to count it all joy when we fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of faith produces patience. Pressure is not meant to crush you. It is meant to mature you. It builds endurance, discernment, and leadership stamina. Comfort never develops leaders. Pressure does. Here's the discipline shift required. Stop praying for less pressure and start praying for greater wisdom. Because the pressure is proof that God believes you can handle what's coming. If you were unqualified, the weight would break you. But grace is holding you up because promotion is near. Think about it practically. You're solving problems you never thought you could handle. You're making decisions you once avoided. You're standing firm where you once would have folded. That's not accidental. That's development. God is expanding your capacity so the next season won't overwhelm you. But here's the warning. Pressure without discipline produces burnout. That's why you must manage your time, guard your energy, and stay spiritually anchored. And he came up to me and said, I just don't understand it. I work harder than everyone I know, but I'm not getting ahead. And I said, let me ask you a question. Are you working hard on your job, or are you working hard on yourself? He paused. And that pause told me everything. Because you see, if you work hard on your job, you can make a living, but if you work hard on yourself, you can make a fortune, not just financially, but in confidence, wisdom, joy, and peace of mind. Now here's the next part. Philosophy doesn't come from one big moment. It comes from little decisions repeated over time. It's formed by what you read, what you listen to, who you hang around, and what you tolerate. That's how a philosophy sneaks up on you, quietly, slowly, almost politely. And one day you wake up and say, well, that's just the way it is. But that phrase has stolen more dreams than failure ever could. You see, the future doesn't respond to need. It responds to preparation. And preparation begins with asking better questions. Questions like, what do I believe about my own ability? What do I believe about discipline? What do I believe about time? Because here's what I know. You will never outperform your own self-image for very long. Let's talk about seasons for a moment, because this is one of the great lessons of life. Life and business and relationships all move in seasons. There's winter, spring, summer, and fall. And the mistake most people make is they try to negotiate with winter. They say, well, maybe this winter won't be so cold. No, winter is winter. It comes every year. And it always brings difficulty, challenge, disappointment, and loss. The key is not to wish for an easier winter. The key is to become stronger. I used to complain about the cold until I learned how to put on a coat. That's maturity. Spring follows winter, but spring doesn't show up because you complain. Spring shows up because you plant. You plant when it's uncomfortable. You plant when you're unsure. You plant when the results aren't visible yet. Summer comes after spring, and summer says, now you must protect what you've started. Protect your time. Protect your habits. Protect your focus. Because weeds grow automatically. Success does not. And then there's fall. Fall asks one question. What did you do with the time you were given? Fall is harvest. And harvest never lies. If you planted well, you reap well. If you planted poorly, or not at all, you still reap. You just don't like what shows up. Think about that for a moment. The good news is this. You don't control the seasons, but you do control what you do in them. And that's where philosophy becomes power. Now let's go a little deeper. Discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. That's not just a nice phrase, it's a law. And every law works, whether you believe in it or not. Discipline is simply doing what you know you should do, even when you don't feel like doing it, especially when you don't feel like doing it. I used to wait until I felt motivated. And then I learned something that changed my life. Motivation follows action, not the other way around. You don't wake up motivated, you wake up human. Motivation comes after you take the first step. Here's what's interesting. The same disciplines that build success also build character. And the same neglects that lead to failure also weaken character. Everything is connected. A few extra minutes of reading each day. A few extra minutes of planning. A few extra minutes of reflection. Those little disciplines practiced daily turn into extraordinary results over time. But here's the challenge. The pain of discipline weighs ounces. The pain of regret weighs tons. And regret usually sounds like this. I should have. I could have. If only I had. Now let me tell you a little story. I once met a man in his 60s who said to me, I kept thinking I had time. And I said, time for what? He said, time to get serious, time to learn, time to change. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, I didn't realize The days were expensive. Think about that. Every day you spend without direction costs you something. Every day you spend without learning costs you something. You're either investing the day or spending it. Now here's where responsibility comes in. Everything begins with responsibility, not blame,